The American middle class was not destroyed by accident. Levittown, New York. One income, one house, one family, one future that still looked affordable. A man comes home from work, opens the front door, and steps into something that now feels almost impossible. A house he can afford. A wife who does not need a second income just to keep the bills paid. Children growing up in a neighborhood where almost every family is moving in the same direction. A pension waiting at the end. A country that still believes something simple. If you work, you should be able to live. If you save, you should be able to own. If you raise a family, the future should get easier, not harder. That was not luxury. That was the American middle-class promise. So why did that promise collapse? People say Americans got lazy. They say the culture broke. They say families stopped budgeting. They say people became irresponsible. No. The American middle class did not die because ordinary people forgot how to work. It died because the system changed its rules. It stopped delivering security through wages, production, and ownership earned through work. And it started delivering survival through assets, debt, leverage, and financial engineering. That is the real story. This slow death is not a mystery. It is not nostalgia. It is not bad luck. It is a structural transformation. And once you see the mechanism, the question changes. You stop asking why life suddenly feels harder. You start asking why the system now demands so much pain just to maintain what used to be normal. Post-war America built a broad middle class through a very specific bargain. But that bargain was slowly replaced. The first warning came from Britain in 1925. London wanted prestige back, credibility back, the image of national strength back. So Britain returned the pound to gold at its old pre-war level. On paper, that looked responsible. Sound money, discipline, national seriousness. But underneath, it was a trap. John Maynard Keynes saw it immediately. If the currency was forced too high, then wages, prices, and employment at home would have to bend around it. Export industries would be hit first. Unemployment would rise. Credit would tighten. Workers would absorb the pain so finance could preserve the appearance of strength. That is where this story really begins. Because a strong currency is never just a number. It is a decision about who must adjust. If policymakers refuse to let finance take the hit, labor takes the hit. If they refuse to let prestige fall, wages fall. If they refuse to let the currency bend, society bends. Britain defended the image of strength while weakening the people living underneath it. America would later build a far more powerful version of that same contradiction, not under gold, under the dollar. And the dollar changed everything. Because the United States did not just become a rich country after the Second World War, it became something much more important. It became the center of the financial world. The world needed dollars. The world needed American bonds. The world needed the safety, liquidity, and scale of U.S. markets. That gave the United States extraordinary power. It also gave the country a dangerous kind of immunity. It could borrow longer, delay reform longer, absorb contradictions longer, stay impressive from the outside long after life inside became harder to hold together. That is one of the deepest reasons the middle class died slowly instead of suddenly. A weaker country would have faced correction earlier. America could keep going. That is why the surface story is so misleading. Markets rise, the dollar stays dominant, the state keeps borrowing. Asset prices recover, the system still looks functional. So people assume the society underneath must still be sound. But that does not follow. A country can remain globally powerful while becoming domestically unaffordable. And once you understand that, the post-war middle-class story looks very different. Because the American middle class was never just a cultural identity. It was never just a salary range. It was an economic machine. It converted work into stability at scale. That is what made it powerful. A paycheck could be converted into a mortgage. A mortgage could be converted into equity. A stable job could be converted into family formation. A pension could be converted into retirement without financial panic. A local economy could support dignity without everyone needing to become an investor, speculator, or debt manager. That was the arrangement. Not perfect, not universal, not morally clean. Millions were excluded from full access to it. Black Americans were denied equal access to housing and credit. Women were locked out of many of the opportunities that made middle-class life look so stable on paper. Entire communities lived underneath the story rather than inside it. But the structure still mattered. For a huge share of the country, the system still made one core promise: ordinary participation could produce ordinary security. That is what vanished. And it did not vanish because Americans stopped wanting it. It vanished because the economy no longer needed a broad middle class to generate wealth. That is the shift. The old model relied on mass production, mass wages, mass consumption, and broad social stability. The new model does not. The new model can generate wealth through financial assets, intellectual property, monopolized services, housing scarcity, debt expansion, and capital gains that do not need to be broadly shared in order to be huge. That is why so many people feel trapped inside a country that still looks rich. The wealth is real, it is just not organized around them anymore. To see how that happened, you have to stop thinking in headlines and start thinking in substitutions. The middle class was not destroyed in one blow. It was slowly replaced, one support at a time. First came the weakening of labor, then the financialization of housing, then the transfer of retirement risk onto households, then the explosion of education costs, then the rise of healthcare as a permanent source of insecurity, then the recovery model that restored asset owners faster than wage earners. Each piece looked separate. It was not. It was the same system learning how to function without needing to protect the broad center of society the way it once did. And once that process started, almost every major crisis made it worse. Take the 1970s. The old post-war order was already under strain. Global competition was rising. Inflation was surging. The Bretton Woods system had fractured. Corporate power was shifting. The industrial settlement that had supported middle-class growth was weakening. Then came the response. In the early 1980s, Paul Volcker raised interest rates aggressively to crush inflation. That was not a minor adjustment. It was a regime change. Money would be made hard again. Credibility would be restored. Inflation would be broken. And inflation did break, but the way it broke mattered. The broader policy mix pulled capital into the United States. The dollar surged. Manufacturing was pressured. Export industries lost competitiveness. Finance became stronger. The parts of the economy tied to making things absorbed the shock first. This is where the official story and the lived story split apart. The official story said America was becoming more disciplined, more competitive, more serious. The lived story in many industrial regions felt very different. It felt like closure, layoffs, plant decline, local businesses thinning out, union power fading, young people leaving, towns losing confidence one employer at a time. And that pattern did not reverse. Manufacturing employment in the United States peaked in 1979. Over the decades that followed, millions of jobs disappeared, not just during recessions, but through recoveries that never rebuilt what had been lost. That matters because manufacturing was not simply one sector among many. It was one of the great delivery systems of middle-class security. It offered wages that could support families without elite credentials. It stabilized whole regions. It gave local economies a spine. When that spine weakened, the loss was larger than payroll data could capture. Because jobs are never just jobs. They are mortgage payments, small business customers, tax bases, school stability, marriage rates, community confidence, the sense that your children can stay and still have a life. When people talk about deindustrialization in abstract terms, they miss the real damage. The real damage is not just that factories close. It is that a society loses one of its most reliable ways of turning work into dignity for people who are not already inside the upper tier of education, finance, or inheritance. That was the first great fracture, and this is where the next substitution begins. Once work stops delivering enough security, the system has to offer another route, so it offers debt. This is one of the central ideas in the entire story. The middle class did not simply become poorer, it became more dependent on borrowing, refinancing, asset appreciation, and balance sheet luck. That is much more dangerous. Because poverty is visible, financial fragility can hide for years. A household can still look middle class while becoming economically hollow. The house is still there, the cars are still outside, the children are still enrolled in activities, the vacations may still happen on credit, the retirement account may still exist on paper, and yet underneath, the structure has changed. The margin for error has collapsed. One medical bill matters more. One rate hike matters more. One layoff matters more. One rent increase matters more. One housing downturn matters more. One broken transmission matters more. One semester of tuition matters more. That is the anatomy of a slow death. It does not always look like visible decline. Often it looks like normal life with no cushion. And once you see it that way, the next stage becomes obvious. Housing stops being shelter and becomes compensation. This is one of the most important transitions in modern American life. As wage growth weakened and stable work became less reliable, households were pushed toward housing as the substitute source of security. If wages were not rising fast enough, maybe the house would. If retirement became less certain, maybe home equity would help. If college became more expensive, maybe the home could be borrowed against. If healthcare costs rose, maybe the house could still anchor the balance sheet. That looked workable for a while. Then it became the trap. Because a healthy middle class uses housing as one piece of stability, a fragile middle class is forced to use housing as almost everything: shelter, savings, collateral, retirement strategy, emergency plan, inheritance vehicle, proof that you made it, protection against everything the rest of the system no longer guarantees. That is too much weight for one asset to carry. But the country kept loading more onto it. So when the housing bubble expanded in the 1990s and early 2000s, it did not simply reflect speculation. It reflected desperation disguised as prosperity. It reflected a country using asset inflation to compensate for weakening wage security. That distinction matters. If a family feels richer because its income is stronger, that is one thing. If a family feels richer because the price of its house is rising while its underlying security is getting weaker, that is something else entirely. That is not restored strength. That is delayed recognition. And then 2008 arrived. This is where the system exposed itself. The housing crash did not just destroy wealth, it revealed how much of the middle-class model had already been hollowed out. Millions of households discovered that they were not standing on broad stability, they were standing on leverage. Their wealth was concentrated. Their security was conditional. Their biggest asset was tied to a financial structure they did not control and barely understood. When housing broke, it did not just erase value. It erased the illusion that private asset appreciation could permanently replace a stronger social bargain. And what happened next made the deeper problem unavoidable. The recovery was not built to restore the old world. It was built to stabilize the system that had replaced it. This is the part that still shapes everything today. After the crash, policymakers prevented total collapse. Credit markets were stabilized. Rates were pushed down. Asset prices were supported. Liquidity flooded the system. Those moves were justified by the emergency. But the effects were unequal by design, because American households do not own the same things. People who owned diversified financial assets recovered first. People with large equity exposure recovered first. People whose wealth was tied to business ownership recovered first. People with access to cheap capital recovered first. Everyone else watched the cost of entry rise again. That is how one crisis becomes a sorting machine, and this is where the modern class structure becomes easier to see. The old divide was income. The new divide is increasingly ownership plus timing. Did you buy the house early enough? Did you build equity before prices ran away? Did you have enough exposure to financial assets before the recovery reflated them? Did you inherit anything? Did your parents own anything? Did your family have enough cushion to survive the years when wages alone stopped being enough? Once that is how a society works, the middle class becomes less a broad, stable center and more a shrinking group of people who entered the right assets at the right time. Everyone else is told to catch up in a game where the price of entry keeps rising faster than wages. That is not a functioning ladder. That is a narrowing gate. This is why so many people feel like they followed the rules and still fell behind. Because they did follow the rules, the structure changed around them. They were told to get educated. Education got more expensive. They were told to buy a home. Homes got harder to buy. They were told to save for retirement. Retirement got tied to volatile markets. They were told to work hard. Hard work became less directly connected to lasting security. They were told to be responsible. Responsibility increasingly meant managing risks the system used to absorb. That is not failure at the individual level. That is redesign at the system level. And once you see that, the economic data stops feeling abstract. It starts feeling like evidence of a pattern you already know. The share of Americans living in middle-class households has fallen over the long term. The middle class still contains a huge portion of the population, but it commands a smaller share of income and a much smaller share of wealth than it once did. That is not just about inequality in the moral sense. It is about how much of the country's economic power still flows through the center. When the center loses enough income, it loses leverage. When it loses enough wealth, it loses resilience. When it loses both at once, it begins to lose its ability to reproduce itself across generations. That is when the decline becomes self-reinforcing. Because the middle class is not rebuilt automatically, it has to be reproduced. Parents need enough security to help children launch. Children need a realistic path into housing, family formation, and savings. Local economies need enough stable demand to support ordinary life. Work needs to generate enough surplus to do more than simply service bills. Once those conditions weaken, the next generation starts lower, and that is one of the darkest parts of this story. The decline of the middle class is no longer just about current households. It is now about transmission. What gets passed down? Assets or debt? Stability or anxiety? A platform or a warning? When previous generations could buy earlier, save earlier, and build earlier, they passed forward not just money, but timing. And timing is now one of the most powerful forms of class advantage in America. If your parents bought a house before prices exploded, timing worked for your family. If your parents accumulated retirement assets during decades of asset inflation, timing worked for your family. If you entered adulthood after the ladder had already narrowed, timing worked against you. This is why the country can feel so divided, even among people with similar values and similar effort. They are not starting from the same timing, and timing in a financialized society becomes destiny faster than most people realize. Now look at the monthly budget. This is where all the macro language becomes real. Because households do not live inside speeches about growth, they live inside bills, rent or mortgage, groceries, insurance, utilities, childcare, healthcare, car payments, gas, tuition, taxes, repairs, unexpected costs that are no longer exceptional because they keep coming. This is why the middle class decline does not need to be argued through theory alone. People feel it every month. They feel it when income rises slower than the cost of staying in place. They feel it when saving money now requires giving something basic up. They feel it when one adult income no longer supports what one adult income used to support. They feel it when two incomes now buy a thinner version of the life one income once covered. That is the kind of shift people do not forget, even if they do not have the vocabulary for it. And increasingly, the official data says the same thing. More households report spending rising faster than income. Large numbers of people say prices have made their finances worse. Bills go unpaid. Medical care gets delayed. Households cut back not because they are careless, but because the margin is gone. This is why the phrase middle-class squeeze is no longer enough. A squeeze sounds temporary. This is not temporary. This is a structural cost regime. It is a society where the price of remaining ordinary has risen faster than the institutions that once made ordinary life possible. That is a much deeper problem. And housing reveals it better than almost anything else. Housing is where wages, land, credit, scarcity, interest rates, and class all collide in one payment. It is the most visible place where the old middle-class ladder has turned into a modern gatekeeping system. If you entered early, housing inflation can make you feel protected. If you entered late, housing inflation can define your entire adulthood. That is not a small distinction. It determines whether you build equity or fund someone else's, whether you stabilize or drift, whether you stay close to opportunity or get pushed farther out, whether starting a family feels possible or reckless, whether one generation can help the next or merely warn it. And this is why the housing story is bigger than real estate. It is a story about class reproduction. If shelter becomes scarce enough and expensive enough, it stops being a foundation and starts becoming a filter. That filter sorts households by income, by timing, by parental wealth, by geography, by interest rate environment, and by how much pain they can absorb while still moving forward. Once housing becomes that kind of filter, the middle class cannot regenerate in the old way. It becomes much easier to preserve wealth than to build it. And when that happens at scale, the society changes. People delay marriage, delay children, delay ownership, delay moving out, delay risk, delay adulthood itself. These are often talked about as cultural trends. They are not just cultural. They are balance sheet consequences. That is why the story cannot be reduced to vibes or values. It is structural all the way down. But here is the deeper problem. The United States can live with these contradictions longer than most countries can. That is where the dollar comes back into the story. because a normal country with this much internal strain might face a violent correction sooner. A currency crisis, a debt panic, a forced reset, a brutal external reckoning that compels political change. America gets more time. The world still wants its debt. The world still wants its currency. The world still runs toward its markets in moments of fear. That gives the system room to borrow, room to extend, room to delay, room to protect financial credibility even while social credibility erodes. That is one reason the decline feels so confusing. The country still looks powerful in the places most people are told to watch. The dollar still matters. Bond markets still function. Stock prices recover. The state still funds itself. Capital still arrives. So the official conclusion is obvious. Everything must still be basically strong. But that is the wrong conclusion. Those are measures of systemic centrality. They are not measures of ordinary security. The two can move apart for years. A nation can be indispensable to global finance and increasingly hostile to ordinary middle-class life at the same time. In fact, reserve currency privilege can help prolong exactly that split. That is why this story is not simply about economics anymore. It is about legitimacy. A strong middle class does more than spend money. It stabilizes belief. It tells people that the system still works in a way they can recognize, that effort still matters, that adulthood is difficult but navigable, that sacrifice is rewarded with something more durable than survival. When that belief weakens, the damage spreads beyond budgets. People stop trusting reassurance. They stop believing recovery language. They stop hearing the economy is strong as comfort. They hear it as distance. Because they know what their own life costs. They know what it takes now just to remain in place. They know how many things must go right to preserve a life that used to require fewer miracles. This is where the emotional tone of the country changes, not because people become irrational, because the promises they grew up around no longer match the structure they live inside. That is a dangerous place for any society to stay too long, especially one this large, this armed, this unequal, this indebted, and this central to the global system. Because once a middle class weakens enough, instability does not always appear first as riots or collapse. Often it appears as exhaustion. People retreat. They shrink their plans. They avoid risk. They stop believing institutions can improve their lives. They become easier to govern economically and harder to govern democratically. They lose trust without necessarily gaining a coherent alternative. That is one of the most corrosive outcomes of all. The center of society does not need to disappear completely for a country to become unstable. It just needs to become too weak to carry the emotional and economic load placed on it. And that is where America has been heading for a long time. The middle class did not simply shrink. It was made less necessary to the way modern wealth is produced. That is the sentence everything else turns on. In the old economy, broad middle-class stability was central to the system. In the new economy, enormous wealth can be produced through technology, finance, platform power, asset inflation, restricted supply, and scale that does not require a proportionately secure workforce underneath it. Once that is true, the political temptation becomes obvious. Why rebuild a broad social bargain if markets can still rise without it? Why restore labor's leverage if asset values can carry confidence? Why make housing cheaper if scarcity rewards incumbent owners? Why lower the cost of education if debt can finance access? Why build a stronger public floor if private balance sheets are still being managed well enough to avoid immediate revolt? That is how systems drift into cruelty without always naming it as cruelty. No single actor has to announce the destruction of the middle class. The incentives do the work. Every institution protects its own logic. Finance protects asset values. Universities protect tuition flows. Healthcare systems protect revenue structures. Local homeowners protect scarcity. Corporations protect margins. The state protects financial credibility. The central bank protects monetary order. And the household stands at the end of that chain, trying to survive the combined output of all of them. That is why so many people feel trapped inside a machine no one seems to fully control. Because in one sense, they are. The system is not maintained by one villain. It is maintained by overlapping incentives that all make sense locally and produce instability collectively. This is why reform is so difficult. Each part of the machine can defend itself. Each part can justify itself. Each part can say, the real problem is somewhere else. Meanwhile, the middle class keeps paying in fragments. Higher rent here, higher tuition there, higher deductibles somewhere else. More fragile work, less time, less margin. More dependence on asset luck. More dependence on parental help. More dependence on timing. And because the losses arrive in fragments, many people never call it structural decline. They call it adulthood. That may be the darkest achievement of the new system. It has normalized conditions that would have once been recognized as warning signs. Permanent housing anxiety, permanent medical cost anxiety, permanent retirement anxiety, permanent educational cost anxiety, permanent downward vigilance over every line item in a family budget. All of that now passes for realism. But realism for whom? A strong society does not ask this many households to live one setback away from instability and then call it resilience. That is not resilience. That is successful adaptation to decline. And that is why the title matters. The American middle class was not destroyed by accident. It was structurally displaced. Not by one law, not by one election, not by one crisis, but by an economy that learned how to keep producing wealth, prestige, and asset appreciation without preserving broad security in the center of society. That is the warning. Because once a society loses the habit of building stability through ordinary participation, it starts teaching people a different lesson. Do not trust wages. Do not trust institutions. Do not trust promises. Get into assets early if you can. Borrow if you must. Compete harder. Hope timing is kind to you. And if it is not, call your insecurity normal. That is not the language of a healthy middle class. That is the language of survival inside a system that has already moved on. So the real question is no longer whether the middle class still exists in a statistical sense. The real question is whether America still knows how to build a country where ordinary work creates ordinary security at scale, because that is what has been fading. Not dramatically enough for one clean headline, not suddenly enough for everyone to name it, but steadily. The country kept the language of broad prosperity while replacing the machinery underneath it. It kept the symbolism of ownership while making entry harder. It kept the rhetoric of opportunity while concentrating the upside. It kept the appearance of national strength while shifting more risk onto households. It kept calling people middle class while stripping away the protections that once made the term meaningful. That is why the title is more literal than it sounds. The American middle class was not destroyed by accident. It was structurally displaced by an economy that can still produce wealth without producing broad security. And that is the warning. If this video made you see the system differently, then you are exactly who this channel is for. History has the answers. I just show you where to look. If you want to understand the macroeconomic traps you are living inside and how to survive them instead of just participating in the game, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next, we break down which assets actually survive these shifts, which ones become traps, and what history teaches those who refuse to stay blind. Drop a comment. Do you think the middle class can still be rebuilt, or has the system already moved on? Because when the middle class dies slowly enough, most people do not call it collapse, they call it normal life.